I heard my husband tell another woman that his wife was already gone, so I decided to make his bank account disappear right along with me. What started as a routine Tuesday afternoon turned into the moment I discovered my entire marriage was a carefully constructed lie. But by the end of this story, I wasn't the one left with nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 18 years, I believed I was living the suburban dream in Riverside, California. Every morning, I'd wake up in our 2-story house on Maple Street, kiss my husband David goodbye as he headed to his insurance office, and drive to my job as a marketing coordinator at Riverside Health Partners. I thought we were building something together. I thought our joint savings account, our shared mortgage, our weekend barbecues with the neighbors meant we were a team. I was 42 years old and completely blind to the fact that the man sleeping next to me every night was living an entirely different life during his lunch breaks. David and I met in college when I was 24 and he was 27. He was studying business. I was finishing my marketing degree, and he had this way of making me feel like I was the only woman in any room. He'd bring me coffee between classes, remember every important presentation I had, and talk about our future like it was this beautiful painting we were creating together, stroke by stroke. When he proposed 2 years later in the same campus coffee shop where we'd had our first real conversation, I cried so hard the barista offered me free tissues for a month. We got married in a small ceremony at the community center. Nothing fancy because we were saving for a house. David wanted to start building our nest egg immediately. He was smart with money, he said. He understood investments and planning for the future in ways that I didn't. So when we opened our joint savings account 3 months after the wedding, it felt natural to let him handle most of the financial decisions. I contributed my share every month, watched our balance grow, and trusted that David was taking care of us the way he promised he would. Our kids came along within the first 5 years of marriage. Emma arrived when I was 28, and Ryan followed 2 years later. David was a devoted father in those early years, changing diapers at 2 a.m, teaching Emma how to ride her bike, coaching Ryan's little league team. He worked long hours at Premier Insurance Services, but he always made time for family, dinners, and bedtime stories. I genuinely believed we were happy. As the kids grew older and became more independent, David started working even longer hours. He'd leave early for client meetings and come home after 8 most nights, claiming he was building toward a promotion that would set our family up for life. He talked about early retirement, about taking the kids to Europe, about buying a vacation home near the coast. These dreams felt real because David painted them with such vivid detail, and because our savings account seemed to support his ambitious timeline. What I didn't know was that David had been slowly bleeding our joint account dry for the past 8 months, funding a completely separate life with Jessica Parker, a 28-year-old real estate assistant who worked at his friend's agency downtown. While I was home helping Emma with her college applications and driving Ryan to soccer practice, David was taking Jessica to expensive restaurants I'd never heard of, buying her jewelry I'd never seen, and apparently telling her things about our marriage that would have destroyed me if I'd known them sooner. The revelation came on a Tuesday afternoon in late May, when the California sun was beating down on our front porch, and I was watering the flower boxes I'd planted along our walkway. Our neighbor Tom Bradley was outside washing his car in his driveway, and we were making pleasant small talk about the weather and the upcoming neighborhood barbecue. Tom had always been friendly in that casual neighbor way, waving when he saw us, asking how the kids were doing, complimenting the seasonal decorations I put up around our house. Tom paused mid-scrub on his car's hood and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was somewhere between concern and confusion, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't want to be working on. He set down his sponge and walked closer to the fence that separated our driveways. "Sarah," he said, his voice careful and quiet. "I hope you don't mind me asking, But is everything okay between you and David? I mean, with the separation and everything, I just want to make sure you're doing all right. I stopped watering midstream, confused. Separation? Tom, what are you talking about? We're not separated. Tom's face went completely pale. He looked like someone who'd just realized they'd walked into the wrong conversation. Oh, he stammered. Oh no. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I thought you knew. I thought that's why David's been staying at the apartment complex over on River Road. He told my buddy Mike that you two were separated, that it was temporary while you worked things out. My hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the watering can. The water kept flowing, soaking into the dirt around my feet, while my brain tried to process what Tom had just said. David had been telling people we were separated. David had been staying somewhere else. David had been living a completely different narrative about our marriage, and I had been the only person who didn't know the story had changed. I managed to keep my voice steady, though everything inside me was crumbling. Tom, when did David tell Mike this? How long has this been going on? Tom was clearly uncomfortable now, shifting his weight from foot to foot and avoiding direct eye contact. I don't know exactly, Sarah. Maybe a couple months? Mike mentioned it when we were talking about the guys' poker night, said David couldn't host anymore because of the situation at home. I really thought you knew. I would never have brought it up if I'd realized. I forced a smile that felt like it was splitting my face. Of course, Tom. Thanks for checking on me. We're just figuring things out privately. You know how it is. He nodded quickly, clearly relieved to escape the awkwardness of the moment. Let me know if you need anything, Sarah. You're good people. After Tom went back to his car, I stood in my front yard for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching the water from my hose create a small puddle in the grass. My mind was racing through the past few months, looking for signs I'd missed, explanations I'd accepted too easily, moments when David's behavior should have raised red flags but hadn't because I trusted him completely. The late nights at work suddenly made sense in a horrible new way. The phone calls he'd take in the garage, claiming they were work calls that couldn't wait until morning. The weekend client meetings that seemed to happen more and more frequently. The new cologne he'd started wearing, subtle but different from the one he'd used for years. The way he'd become protective of his phone, taking it with him even when he went to the bathroom or ran out to get the mail. I walked back into our house, which suddenly felt like a stage set for a play I hadn't auditioned for. Everything looked the same. The family photos on the mantle, the kids' artwork still hanging on the refrigerator from years past, the coffee mug David had used that morning sitting in the sink. But the context had shifted so dramatically that I felt like I was seeing it all through different eyes. I sat down at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd planned family vacations and helped kids with homework and discussed our retirement dreams, and tried to figure out what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to call David immediately and demand an explanation. Part of me wanted to drive to his office and confront him in front of his colleagues. But a larger part of me, the part that had been married to this man for 18 years, knew that I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before I made any moves. That evening, David came home at his usual time, around 8:30, carrying his briefcase and wearing the same tired expression he'd been carrying for months. He kissed my cheek in the same perfunctory way he'd been doing lately, asked about my day in the same distracted tone, and settled into his recliner with his phone while I finished cleaning up dinner. Everything about his behavior was exactly the same as it had been for weeks, but now I was watching him with different eyes. I noticed how he held his phone at an angle so I couldn't see the screen. I saw how his face lit up in a way that had nothing to do with work emails when certain messages came through. I observed the careful way he answered my questions about his day, giving me just enough detail to seem forthcoming while actually telling me nothing specific about where he'd been or who he'd been with. When I asked him about his schedule for the rest of the week, David told me he had several client dinners planned and might need to stay late a couple of nights to catch up on paperwork. The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that I realized this wasn't new behavior. This was practiced deception that had been happening for months while I remained completely oblivious. That night, after David fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and listening to him breathe. This man who had shared my bed for 18 years, who knew exactly how I liked my coffee and remembered to record my favorite shows, had been constructing an elaborate fiction about our marriage while sleeping next to me every night. He'd been telling people we were separated while still coming home to me, still letting me do his laundry and cook his meals and maintain the household we'd built together. The betrayal felt surreal because it was so complete. This wasn't just an affair. This was a systematic dismantling of our entire relationship, done so carefully and gradually that I hadn't noticed it happening. David had essentially divorced me in his mind and in his conversations with other people, but had failed to mention this development to me. As I lay there in the dark, I started thinking about our finances. If David was maintaining a separate residence, if he was lying about where he spent his evenings and weekends, what else might he be lying about? Our joint savings account had been his responsibility for years, and I'd trusted him to manage it responsibly while I focused on my own career and our children's needs. But trust, I was beginning to realize, might have been the most expensive luxury I'd ever afforded myself. I made a mental note to check our bank statements the next day, though part of me was afraid of what I might find. If David was capable of lying about something as fundamental as our marital status. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Status. What other secrets might be hiding in plain sight? The man sleeping next to me suddenly felt like a stranger, and the life I thought we'd built together started to feel like an elaborate performance that only I had been taking seriously. The next morning, David left for work with the same goodbye kiss and the same promise to call me later that day. But this time, instead of heading straight to my own job, I called in and told my supervisor I needed to take a personal day. I had some investigating to do, and I had a feeling that what I discovered was going to change everything about the life I thought I'd been living. The first thing I did after David left for work was make myself a strong cup of coffee and sit down at my laptop. My hands were trembling slightly as I logged into our joint bank account, something I hadn't done in months because David always handled our finances and gave me updates during our weekly household discussions. The login screen felt foreign, even though it was my name on the account too. When the page finally loaded, the numbers that appeared on my screen made my stomach drop. Our savings account, which should have contained nearly $45,000 based on our regular contributions and David's assurances about our financial health, showed a balance of less than $8,000. I stared at the screen for several minutes, certain there had to be some mistake. Maybe I was looking at the wrong account, or maybe there was a delay in updating the balance, or maybe David had moved money into a different investment account without mentioning it. I scrolled through the transaction history, and what I found there made me feel physically sick. For the past 8 months, there had been regular withdrawals and transfers that I had never authorized and had never been told about. The amounts ranged from small cash withdrawals of a few $100s to major transfers of several $1,000s at a time. Many of the transactions had memo lines that made no sense to me. Restaurant charges for amounts that seemed impossibly high for one person. Hotel bookings in cities where David had never mentioned traveling for work. Jewelry store purchases that certainly hadn't resulted in gifts for me or our children. The pattern was methodical and deliberate. David had been systematically draining our account while maintaining the fiction that our finances were stable and growing. Every month when he told me we were on track with our savings goals, he was lying directly to my face while simultaneously stealing from the future we were supposed to be building together. I printed out 6 months of statements and spread them across our dining room table, highlighting the suspicious transactions with a yellow marker. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. This wasn't a case of poor financial judgment or unexpected expenses. This was calculated theft, carried out by someone who had intimate access to our money and no intention of being honest about how he was using it. My phone rang while I was still processing the financial betrayal, and I saw Lisa Chen's name on the caller ID. Lisa was my closest friend and co-worker, someone I'd known for nearly 10 years and trusted completely. We talked almost every day, shared our frustrations about work and parenting, and had supported each other through various life challenges. If anyone would know how to help me process what I was discovering, it would be Lisa. "Sarah," Lisa said when I answered, "you sound terrible. What's wrong?" "I'm not sure where to start," I replied, looking at the bank statements scattered across my table. "Lisa, how well do you think you can really know someone, even after 18 years of marriage?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's a loaded question," she said carefully. "What's going on with David?" I told her about Tom's revelation regarding the separation David had been claiming, and about the financial discoveries I'd made that morning. Lisa listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of disbelief or sympathy. When I finished explaining everything I'd learned in the past 24 hours, she was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah," she finally said, "I need to tell you something, and I should have told you months ago. I've been seeing David around town with a woman who isn't you." At first, I thought maybe it was work-related, but their body language suggested something more personal. I convinced myself it wasn't my place to say anything, especially since I didn't have concrete proof of anything inappropriate. But given what you're telling me now, I think you need to know. My heart started pounding. "What woman? Where did you see them?" "A younger woman with long blonde hair, very put together. I saw them at Antonella's Italian restaurant 3 different times over the past few months, always at lunch. They were sitting close together, holding hands across the table, acting like a couple. The last time I saw them, she was wearing what looked like an expensive necklace, and David was feeding her bites of dessert in a way that was definitely not professional. The image Lisa painted made me feel nauseated. Antonella's was an upscale restaurant downtown that David and I had never been to together because he always claimed it was too expensive for casual dining. Apparently, it wasn't too expensive when he was using our joint savings to impress his girlfriend. "Lisa," I said, voice shaking, "why didn't you tell me?" "Because I hoped I was wrong," she replied. "Because I didn't want to destroy your marriage over something that might have had an innocent explanation. Because I was being a coward, and I'm sorry for that. But Sarah, you need to understand that what I witnessed looked like a relationship that had been going on for a while. They were comfortable together, familiar with each other's preferences, acting like an established couple." After I hung up with Lisa, I sat in my kitchen and tried to process the complete picture that was emerging. My husband of 18 years had been living a double life for at least 8 months. He'd been telling people we were separated while continuing to live in our house and maintain the pretense of our marriage. He'd been systematically stealing from our joint savings account to fund his relationship with another woman. He'd been taking this woman to expensive restaurants and buying her expensive gifts while telling me we needed to be careful with our spending. The level of deception was staggering. But what hurt even more was the realization that David had been planning this betrayal for months without giving me any opportunity to address problems in our marriage or fight for our relationship. He'd simply decided unilaterally that our marriage was over and had begun acting accordingly, while leaving me completely in the dark about his decision. I called my office and extended my personal day through the end of the week, claiming a family emergency that wasn't entirely untrue. Then I drove to the public library downtown, where I could use their computers and internet connection without worrying about David somehow monitoring my online activity. I needed to do some research, and I needed to do it without leaving any digital footprints on our home computer. At the library, I created a new email account that David didn't know about, and began researching divorce attorneys in our area. I also looked up information about financial fraud within marriages and discovered that what David had been doing with our joint account might constitute financial abuse, especially since he'd been concealing the transactions from me while I continued contributing my own money to the account. I spent the rest of the afternoon learning about my legal rights and options. I discovered that California is a community property state, which meant that assets acquired during our marriage should be divided equally in a divorce. I learned about forensic accounting, which could help track where our money had gone and potentially recover some of it. I found out about temporary restraining orders that could prevent David from accessing our joint accounts while divorce proceedings were pending. For the first time since Tom had revealed David's lies, I started to feel like I had some control over my situation. I wasn't just a victim of David's deception. I was a woman with legal rights and financial resources of my own. I had my own income, my own credit, and my own ability to make decisions about my future. When I got home that afternoon, I began quietly gathering important documents. I made copies of our tax returns, insurance policies, property deeds, and investment statements. I photographed the bank statements I'd printed that morning and stored the images in my new email account. I created a folder of evidence that would help me understand the full scope of our financial situation and David's unauthorized use of our money. That evening, David came home at his usual time, greeting me with the same casual kiss and distracted demeanor he'd been displaying for months. He asked about my day, and I told him I'd taken some time off to catch up on household projects. He seemed pleased that I was staying busy and didn't ask for any specifics about what projects I'd been working on. During dinner, I found myself studying David's face and wondering how someone could lie so consistently and convincingly. He talked about his workday, mentioned a difficult client he was trying to help, and discussed plans for Ryan's upcoming soccer tournament. Everything about his behavior suggested a normal, devoted husband and father, but I now knew that this entire persona was carefully constructed fiction. After the kids went to bed, David settled into his usual evening routine of watching television while scrolling through his phone. I sat beside him on the couch, pretending to read a magazine while actually observing his reactions to whatever messages he was receiving. His face would light up periodically, and he'd type quick responses with the kind of focused attention he used to give me when we were first dating. Around 10 o'clock, David's phone rang, and he glanced at the screen before declining the call. A few minutes later, it rang again, and again he declined it. The third time it rang, he answered quickly and walked out onto our back patio to take the call privately. I could hear the murmur of his voice through the sliding glass door, but I couldn't make out specific words. His tone was soft and affectionate, completely different from the tired, distracted way he'd been speaking to me for months. He was out there for nearly 20 minutes, and when he came back inside, he was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. "Emergency at work," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "One of my clients is having issues with a claim, and I need to help walk them through the paperwork tomorrow morning. I might need to go in early." I nodded and smiled, playing along with his lie while mentally noting that it was now nearly 10:30 at night, which seemed like an unusual time for a client to be calling about insurance paperwork. But I was beginning to understand that David's lies weren't meant to be believable. They were just meant to create enough plausible deniability that I wouldn't ask too many questions. The next morning, David did leave earlier than usual, claiming he needed to meet with the client who had called the night before. After he left, I decided it was time to get some visual confirmation of what I already suspected. I knew David's usual schedule and his typical lunch hour, and I had a good idea of where I might find him based on Lisa's previous sightings. I dressed carefully in clothes David wouldn't recognize from a distance, put on sunglasses and a baseball cap, and drove downtown to the area around Premier Insurance Services. I parked across the street from his office building and waited, feeling like a private investigator in a bad movie, but knowing I needed to see the truth with my own eyes. At 12:15, David emerged from his building, but instead of walking to his usual lunch spot or his car, he walked 2 blocks down the street to where a blonde woman was waiting outside a small boutique. Even from a distance, I could see that she was young and attractive, dressed in a fitted dress and high heels that made her legs look impossibly long. David approached her with a familiarity that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. He kissed her on the mouth, put his arm around her waist, and guided her toward Antonella's restaurant, the same place Lisa had seen them together multiple times. They were holding hands and talking animatedly, looking like any other couple enjoying a lunch date, except that one half of this couple was married to someone else. I followed them at a safe distance and positioned myself at a coffee shop across the street from Antonella's, where I had a clear view through the restaurant's large front windows. I watched David and this woman settle into a corner booth, the same booth where he and I had never sat because we'd never been to this restaurant together. I watched him order what appeared to be an expensive bottle of wine with their lunch. I watched them lean across the table toward each other, completely absorbed in their conversation and oblivious to the world around them. But what I saw next was what finally broke my heart completely. This woman reached into her purse and pulled out what looked like a small wrapped gift, which she slid across the table to David with a shy smile. David opened it immediately, and even from across the street, I could see his face light up with genuine joy and surprise. He reached across the table to take her hands in his, and they both started laughing about something I couldn't hear. The intimacy of the moment was undeniable. This wasn't a casual affair or a temporary lapse in judgment. This was a full relationship, complete with gift-giving and shared jokes and the kind of comfortable affection that takes time to develop. David was living a complete second life with this woman, a life that included all the romantic gestures and emotional connection that had been missing from our marriage for months. I sat in that coffee shop for nearly 2 hours, watching my husband wine and dine another woman with money he'd stolen from our joint account, watching him smile and laugh in ways he hadn't done with me in longer than I could remember. When they finally left the restaurant, David walked her back to what I assumed was her car, kissed her goodbye with the kind of passion I'd almost forgotten existed, and stood on the sidewalk watching her drive away before returning to his office. That afternoon, I drove home in a state of emotional numbness that was almost worse than anger or sadness. The evidence was now overwhelming and undeniable. David was having a serious relationship with another woman he'd been lying to me about virtually every aspect of his daily life for months, and he'd been funding this relationship with money that belonged to both of us. But as I sat in my driveway, looking at the house where I'd raised my children and built what I thought was a stable life, I realized that my primary emotion wasn't heartbreak or betrayal. It was determination. David had systematically deceived me while counting on my trust and passivity to prevent me from discovering his lies. He'd stolen from our joint future while expecting me to continue contributing to the account he was draining. He'd been planning his exit from our marriage while leaving me completely unprepared for the financial and emotional consequences. That evening, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Marcus Rivera, a divorce attorney whose name had come up repeatedly in my research as someone who specialized in complex financial cases. The second was to my bank, to inquire about the process for removing someone from joint accounts. The third was to a locksmith, to schedule an appointment for the following Monday when David would be at work. I wasn't ready to confront David yet, because I wanted to make sure I had all my legal and financial protections in place first. But I was done being the passive victim of his deception. If David wanted to end our marriage, that was his choice. But he wasn't going to get to control the terms and timeline of our separation while keeping me in the dark about his decisions. The next few days passed in a strange state of suspended normalcy. David continued his routine of leaving early and coming home late, telling me stories about difficult clients and demanding deadlines that I now knew were complete fiction. I continued my routine of going to work and taking care of our household, but now I was also secretly meeting with attorneys, reorganizing our finances, and preparing for a confrontation that would change everything about our family's future. On Friday evening, David announced that he would need to work over the weekend on a major client presentation. He'd be staying at the office late both Saturday and Sunday, he said, and might even need to stay overnight at a hotel near his office to avoid the long commute. The lie was so transparent that I almost laughed, but instead I just nodded sympathetically and asked if there was anything I could do to help him prepare. After 18 years of marriage, David apparently believed I was either too trusting or too naive to question his increasingly elaborate deceptions. What he didn't realize was that I'd been spending the week learning exactly how much his lies had already cost us and how much more they were likely to cost him once I was ready to reveal everything I'd discovered. That weekend, while David was presumably enjoying his time with Jessica, I spent my time preparing for a battle I was finally ready to fight. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp sunshine that made everything feel possible. David left for work at his usual time, kissing my forehead absently while scrolling through his phone. He mentioned another late client meeting that evening, which I now understood was code for another romantic dinner with Jessica. I smiled and wished him a productive day, while mentally counting down the hours until the locksmith would arrive to change every lock on our house. Marcus Rivera had been clear during our Friday consultation about the importance of timing and preparation. He'd explained that in cases involving financial deception, the betrayed spouse needed to move quickly and decisively once they decided to take action. Every day David had continued access to our joint resources was another day he could cause additional financial damage or hide assets that rightfully belonged to both of us. The locksmith arrived at 10 in the morning, an efficient woman named Carol who asked no questions about why I needed every lock changed immediately. While she worked, I called our bank and requested an emergency freeze on all joint accounts pending a formal separation agreement. The customer service representative was sympathetic and professional, explaining that while I couldn't remove David's name from existing joint accounts without his consent, I could prevent any further withdrawals until we resolved our marital status through legal channels. Next, I drove to a different bank across town and opened a new checking and savings account in my name only. I transferred my next paycheck into this new account and set up automatic payments for my car insurance, cell phone, and other personal expenses. For the first time in 18 years, I had financial resources that were completely under my control. By noon, I had also changed the passwords on all our shared online accounts, from Netflix to the grocery store rewards program. David would discover these changes gradually over the next few days, but by then it would be too late for him to hide any additional evidence of his deception. The most difficult task was explaining the situation to Emma and Ryan without completely destroying their relationship with their father. I had decided to wait until after I confronted David before having detailed conversations with the kids, but I needed them to understand that some changes were coming to our family structure. When Emma came home from school that afternoon, I asked her to sit with me in the living room for a few minutes. At 16, Emma was perceptive enough to have noticed the tension in our house over the past few months, though she'd attributed it to normal parental stress about finances and work pressures. "Mom," Emma said, settling onto the couch beside me, "you look like you've been crying. What's wrong?" I took a deep breath and tried to find words that would be honest without being unnecessarily hurtful. "Emma, your father and I are having some serious problems in our marriage. I've discovered that he hasn't been truthful with me about some important things, and we're probably going to need to separate while we figure out what happens next." Emma's face went pale. "Are you getting divorced?" "I don't know yet," I replied. "That's going to depend on whether your father is willing to be honest about what's been happening and whether we can rebuild the trust that's been broken. But I want you to know that whatever happens between your father and me, it has nothing to do with you or Ryan. You are both loved and wanted, and we're going to make sure you feel secure no matter what changes occur in our family." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd told her. "Is Dad having an affair?" Her directness surprised me, but I realized I shouldn't have been shocked. Emma was intelligent and observant, and she'd probably noticed more about her father's behavior, changes than I'd given her credit for. I decided that honesty was more respectful than evasion. "Yes," I said simply. "He is." Emma nodded slowly, and I could see her working through the implications. "That's why he's been so weird lately. Ryan and I thought maybe his work was just really stressful, but it makes more sense that he was feeling guilty about lying to you." We talked for another hour about practical matters. I assured Emma that she would still be able to apply to her top-choice colleges, that our family's financial problems wouldn't impact her education plans. I explained that she and Ryan might need to spend some weekends with David at a different residence, but that our house would remain their primary home. I promised that I would never ask her to choose sides or deliver messages between her father and me. When Ryan came home an hour later, I had a similar conversation with him, though I kept the details more age-appropriate for a 14-year-old. Ryan was primarily concerned about whether he'd still be able to play soccer and whether his friends would find out about our family problems. I reassured him that his activities would continue as normal and that our personal business would remain private unless he chose to share it. Both kids seemed relieved to finally understand why the atmosphere in our house had been so tense lately. Emma admitted that she'd been worried one of us was seriously ill, and Ryan said he'd thought maybe we were having money troubles that might force us to move. The truth was difficult, but it was apparently less frightening than the scenarios they'd been imagining. That evening, I prepared for David's return with the same careful attention I'd once given to planning surprise parties or special dinners. I made sure Emma and Ryan were both in their rooms with their doors closed, claiming they needed to focus on homework. I set out the printed bank statements on our dining room table, along with the photos I'd taken of David and Jessica at the restaurant. I opened a bottle of wine and poured myself a glass, not because I needed liquid courage, but because I wanted David to see that I was calm and in control of this conversation. David arrived home at 8:30, later than usual, but consistent with his recent pattern. He walked into the kitchen with his typical distracted greeting, loosening his tie and asking about the kids' evening activities. I let him pour himself a drink and settle into his usual post-work routine before I spoke. "David," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I need you to come into the dining room. We have some things to discuss." Something in my tone must have alerted him that this wasn't going to be a routine conversation about household logistics or weekend plans. He looked at me more carefully than he had in months, and I saw a flicker of concern cross his face. "Can it wait until after dinner?" he asked. "I've had a really long day and I'm exhausted." "No," I replied. "It can't wait. We need to talk now." David followed me into the dining room, and I watched his face change as he saw the bank statement spread across our table. His complexion went from tired to pale to nearly gray in a matter of seconds. He sat down heavily in his usual chair, staring at the evidence of his financial deception without attempting to deny or explain it. "Sarah," he began, his voice already defensive, "I can explain all of this." "I'm sure you can," I said, taking a sip of my wine. "But before you start explaining, I want you to know that I've seen you with Jessica. I know about the apartment you've been staying at. I know about the stories you've been telling people about our separation. I know about the restaurants and the gifts and the jewelry. So when you start explaining, please make sure you're telling me the truth, because I already know what the truth is." David's shoulders sagged, and for the first time in months, he looked directly at me with something approaching honesty. "How long have you known? About the affair? Since last Tuesday. About the money? Since last Wednesday. About the lies you've been telling our neighbors and friends? Since last Tuesday afternoon when Tom Bradley asked me about our separation." David put his head in his hands, and I could see him trying to figure out how to salvage a situation that was completely beyond repair. When he looked up again, his expression had shifted from defensive to calculating, and I realized he was about to try a different approach. "Sarah, our marriage has been over for a long time. We both know that. We've been going through the motions for months, maybe years. Jessica helped me realize that I deserve to be happy, that we both deserve to be with people who actually want to be with us. I set down my wine glass carefully, making sure my voice remained calm. David, if our marriage has been over for a long time, why didn't you mention that to me? Why did you continue to sleep in our bed and let me do your laundry and cook your meals and contribute my paycheck to our joint savings account? Why did you let me believe we were working toward a future together while you were spending our money on your girlfriend? He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you unnecessarily. So instead, you decided to steal from me for 8 months while lying to my face every day? That was your strategy for avoiding unnecessary hurt? David's face flushed with anger, and I recognized the expression he wore when he felt cornered and was about to lash out. It's not stealing when it's my money, too. I work hard for every dollar in that account, and I have a right to spend it however I choose. You have a right to spend money from our joint account on another woman without telling me? You have a right to drain our savings while I continue contributing to it under false pretenses? You have a right to fund your affair with money I helped earn. David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. Sarah, you're being dramatic about this. It's not like I left you with nothing. You have your own job, your own income. You're not some helpless victim here. I stared at him, genuinely shocked by his complete lack of remorse or accountability. You're right, David. I'm not a helpless victim. I'm a woman who's been systematically deceived and financially abused by her husband of 18 years. But you're also right that I'm not helpless, which is why I've already taken steps to protect myself and our children from any additional damage you might cause. What steps? He asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. I've frozen our joint accounts. I've changed the locks on this house. I've moved my paycheck to a separate bank where you can't access it. I've consulted with a divorce attorney who specializes in financial fraud cases. And I've documented every unauthorized transaction you've made from our savings account over the past 8 months. David's face went white. You can't freeze my accounts. That's my money, too. Actually, I can freeze accounts when there's evidence of financial abuse, which is what unauthorized withdrawals to fund an extramarital affair constitute under California law. And they're not your accounts anymore, David. As of this morning, you no longer have access to any financial resources that include my name or my contributions. He sat back down heavily, and I could see him processing the reality that his comfortable, double life had just become significantly more complicated. For months, he'd been able to have both the stability of our marriage and the excitement of his affair, funded by our joint resources. Now he was going to have to choose between his old life and his new one, and he was going to have to do it without my financial support. Sarah, he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone I hadn't heard in years. We can work this out. I made some mistakes, but we can fix this. Jessica doesn't mean anything to me. She was just a distraction because I was feeling lonely in our marriage. I looked at him with something approaching pity. David, I watched you with her. I saw how you looked at her, how you touched her, how you laughed with her. That wasn't loneliness or distraction. That was love. Or at least a very convincing imitation of it. Don't insult both of us by pretending otherwise. He tried again. I'll end it with her. I'll get counseling. I'll do whatever it takes to save our marriage. You'll do whatever it takes to avoid the financial consequences of divorce, I corrected. You'll do whatever it takes to maintain access to my income and our joint assets. But you won't do it because you love me or because you're genuinely sorry for what you've done. You'll do it because the alternative is more expensive and inconvenient than you'd anticipated. David was quiet for a long time, staring at the bank statements and photos spread across our table. When he finally spoke again, his voice was flat and resigned. What do you want from me, Sarah? What's it going to take to resolve this? I want you to pack a bag and leave this house tonight. I want you to stay wherever you've been staying on the nights you claim to be working late. I want you to tell Emma and Ryan the truth about why our marriage is ending. And I want you to attend mediation with me next week to work out custody, arrangements, and financial settlements. David looked up sharply. You're really going through with this? You're really going to destroy our family over this? I'm not destroying our family, David. You already did that when you decided to cheat on me and steal from me while lying to our children and our friends about our relationship. I'm just refusing to continue pretending that what you destroyed is still intact. He pushed back from the table and stood up again, this time with the resigned posture of someone who'd realized that the conversation wasn't going to end with his preferred outcome. Fine, Sarah. If this is how you want to handle it, then fine. But don't come crying to me when you realize how hard it's going to be to manage everything on your own. I've been managing everything on my own for months, David. The only difference is that now I won't be financing your double life while I do it. After David went upstairs to pack, I sat alone at our dining room table, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, and waited for the emotional collapse I'd been expecting. But instead of feeling devastated or heartbroken, I felt something much more powerful and unfamiliar. I felt free. For months, I'd been living with a vague sense that something was wrong in my marriage, but I'd attributed it to normal midlife stress and the natural evolution of long-term relationships. I'd been trying harder to be understanding, more patient, more accommodating, believing that David's distance and distraction were temporary problems that would resolve themselves with time and effort. Now I understood that the problem hadn't been my lack of effort or understanding. The problem had been David's systematic deception and my naive trust in his honesty. I'd been trying to fix a marriage that David had already abandoned, pouring energy and money into a relationship that existed only in my imagination. When David came back downstairs with a hastily packed suitcase, he paused in the doorway of the dining room. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I really am sorry that it came to this." "I know you are," I replied. "You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry that lying to me for 8 months turned out to have consequences. You're sorry that you can't have both your wife and your girlfriend indefinitely. But David, if you were actually sorry for what you did to me and our children, you would have stopped doing it months ago." He left without another word, and I heard his car pull out of our driveway for what I suspected would be the last time. Then I poured myself another glass of wine, cleaned up the papers scattered across our table, and began planning the next phase of my life as a single woman with 2 teenagers and a much clearer understanding of my own worth. The first week after David left passed in a strange combination of relief and administrative chaos. Every day brought new discoveries about the extent of his deception, but also new confirmations that I'd made the right decision in forcing him out of our house and our joint financial accounts. The locksmith bills and attorney consultations were expensive, but they felt like investments in my future rather than costs I resented paying. Marcus Rivera proved to be exactly the kind of advocate I needed during this process. He was thorough, strategic, and completely unsympathetic to David's attempts to minimize his financial misconduct. During our second meeting, Marcus explained that David's unauthorized use of our joint savings to fund his affair could be considered dissipation of marital assets under California law, which meant that David might be required to reimburse me for every dollar he'd spent on Jessica. "We're talking about roughly $37,000 in unauthorized withdrawals over 8 months, Marcus said, reviewing the forensic analysis his paralegal had completed. Restaurant bills, hotel charges, jewelry purchases, cash advances, even what appears to be a weekend trip to Las Vegas that you obviously didn't take with him. All of this was funded with community property while he was actively deceiving you about the state of your marriage. The numbers were staggering when presented as a comprehensive total. David hadn't just been having an affair, he'd been conducting an expensive romance that cost more than many people's annual salaries. The weekend in Las Vegas alone had cost over $4,000, charged to our joint credit card during a weekend when David had told me he was attending a work conference in Sacramento. Marcus also discovered that David had opened 2 additional credit cards in his name only, but using our shared address and his inflated claims about our household income to qualify for higher credit limits. These cards carried balances totaling nearly $15,000, all spent during the same 8-month period when he'd been draining our savings account. The pattern suggested that David had been living far beyond even our combined means, funding a lifestyle with Jessica that we genuinely couldn't afford even if I'd been a willing participant. But the most infuriating discovery came when Marcus's team traced the hotel charges David had been making during his supposed work trips. Not only had David been staying in expensive hotels with Jessica instead of attending client meetings, but he'd been claiming these trips as business expenses on our tax returns. This meant that David had been lying to the IRS about personal travel, while simultaneously lying to me about the purpose and nature of his absences from home. Marcus explained that tax fraud was a federal crime, and that David's financial deception might have legal consequences beyond our divorce proceedings. The IRS tends to take a dim view of personal expenses being claimed as business deductions, especially when those expenses involve extramarital affairs and luxury accommodations. While Marcus handled the legal complexities of our situation, I focused on rebuilding my daily life as a single mother. Emma and Ryan adjusted to their father's absence more easily than I'd expected, partly because David had been so emotionally absent for months that his physical absence wasn't a dramatic change for them. Emma admitted that she felt relieved not to walk on eggshells around David's unpredictable moods, and Ryan said he preferred the calmer atmosphere in our house now that there was no underlying tension between their parents. The kids spent their first weekend with David at his new apartment, a furnished one-bedroom place near downtown that was clearly meant to be temporary housing, rather than a family-friendly environment. When they returned on Sunday evening, Emma was full of observations about David's living situation that confirmed my suspicions about his financial priorities. "Dad's apartment is really small," Emma reported, like smaller than Ryan's bedroom. "But he has this huge flat-screen TV and expensive sound system that must have cost thousands of dollars. And his bathroom is full of fancy cologne and skincare products that definitely weren't there when we visited him at work before." Ryan added that David had taken them to an expensive steakhouse for dinner, the kind of place our family had never been able to afford for casual meals. David had ordered the most expensive items on the menu and left a tip that was larger than what our family typically spent on an entire dinner out. "It's weird," Ryan said. "Dad acts like he has all this money now, but his apartment looks like a college dorm room. It doesn't make sense." I explained to the kids that their father was probably trying to maintain the lifestyle he'd been living with Jessica, even though he no longer had access to our joint resources to fund it. David was likely using credit cards and loans to finance his spending, which would eventually catch up with him in ways that might affect his ability to provide consistent support for Emma and Ryan. My prediction proved accurate sooner than I'd expected. 3 weeks after David moved out, he called me on a Tuesday evening, claiming he needed to discuss important financial matters related to our divorce proceedings. His voice was strained and defensive, lacking the confident arrogance he'd displayed during our confrontation. "Sarah," David said without preamble when I answered his call, "we need to talk about the accounts you froze. I can't access any of my money, and I have bills to pay." "They're not your accounts anymore, David. They're frozen pending our divorce settlement, which means neither of us can access them until we reach a legal agreement about asset division. But I need money for rent and utilities and basic living expenses. You can't just cut me off completely from resources I helped build." "I can, and I did," I replied calmly. "You should have considered your future living expenses before you spent $37,000 of our joint savings on your girlfriend. Maybe Jessica can help you with your rent." There was a long pause, and I could hear David breathing heavily into the phone. "Sarah, I can't ask Jessica for money. That's not how our relationship works. How convenient that you have boundaries about financial exploitation in your relationship with Jessica, but you didn't have those same boundaries in your relationship with me." David's voice became pleading. "Look, I made mistakes, but I'm still the father of your children. You can't leave me homeless and unable to provide for Emma and Ryan when they visit me. Emma and Ryan will be fine staying with you in whatever housing you can afford with your own income. They don't need luxury accommodations to maintain a relationship with their father. What they need is honesty and consistency, which you haven't been providing anyway. I hung up before David could continue his attempt to manipulate me into resuming financial support for his lifestyle. But his call confirmed what I'd suspected about his situation. David had been living beyond his means even when he had access to our joint resources. And now that he was limited to his own income, he was discovering that his expensive tastes weren't sustainable. 2 days later, I received a call from Jessica herself, which was a development I hadn't anticipated. Her voice was young and nervous, and she spoke quickly as if she'd rehearsed what she planned to say. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Jessica Parker. I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I felt like you deserved to know some things about what David has been telling me about your marriage." I was curious despite myself. "What kinds of things, Jessica?" "He told me that you two had been separated for over a year, that you were living in the same house for financial reasons, but that your marriage was essentially over. He said you both knew it was finished, but that you were waiting until the kids graduated high school to make it official. He made it sound like your relationship was purely practical at this point." Jessica paused, and I could hear her taking a shaky breath before continuing. "But then I started seeing charges on David's credit cards for things that didn't make sense if you two were really separated. Grocery stores near your house, gas stations in your neighborhood, restaurants where..." He said he was taking business clients, but the amounts were too small for business meals. It looked like he was still living a full life with you while also maintaining a relationship with me. I found myself feeling almost sorry for Jessica, who was clearly much younger and more naive than I'd realized. She'd been lied to just as systematically as I had, though her consequences were likely to be less severe than mine. Jessica continued talking, her voice gaining strength as she worked through her thoughts. "And then when you froze the accounts and David suddenly couldn't afford to take me to nice restaurants or buy me gifts anymore, I started putting together what had really been happening. He wasn't separated from you at all. He was just using your money to fund our relationship while lying to both of us about what was really going on." "That's correct," I said simply. "David has been living a double life for 8 months, and you and I were both victims of his deception. Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to know that I never would have gotten involved with David if I'd known he was still married and living with you. I'm not the kind of person who breaks up families or steals other women's husbands. I thought I was dating a man who was honestly separated and working toward divorce. I believe you, Jessica. And I hope you understand that David's financial problems are going to get much worse before they get better. He's been living beyond his means for months, and now that he doesn't have access to my income or our joint savings, he's going to have to make some dramatic changes to his lifestyle." There was another pause, and then Jessica said quietly, "He's been asking me to move in with him to help with rent, but his apartment is barely big enough for one person, and I have my own lease and my own life. I don't think I'm ready for that kind of commitment, especially now that I know how much he's been lying about." "That sounds like a wise decision," I replied. "Jessica, can I give you some advice? David is very good at making people feel responsible for solving his problems. He's very good at making his financial difficulties seem like emergencies that require immediate assistance from the people who care about him. But David is a grown man with a decent income, and his current problems are the direct result of choices he made. You don't owe him a solution, and you shouldn't let him convince you that his inability to afford his lifestyle is somehow your responsibility to fix." After I hung up with Jessica, I realized that David's world was collapsing much faster than I'd anticipated. Not only had he lost access to our joint resources, but he was also losing the girlfriend he'd spent 8 months and $37,000 pursuing. Jessica was clearly intelligent enough to recognize that David's financial problems reflected deeper character issues, and she was removing herself from the situation before she became more entangled in his web of deception. The following week, Marcus called with an update about David's response to our divorce petition. David had hired his own attorney, but his legal strategy appeared to be focused entirely on trying to regain access to our joint accounts rather than addressing the underlying issues of financial misconduct and asset dissipation. David's attorney is arguing that you're being vindictive by freezing the accounts, Marcus explained. They're claiming that David has a right to access his share of marital assets during the divorce process, and that preventing him from withdrawing money for living expenses constitutes financial abuse. I almost laughed at the irony. David is claiming that I'm financially abusing him? His attorney seems to believe that's a viable strategy, though I doubt any judge will be sympathetic once they see the evidence of David's unauthorized spending. We have 8 months of documentation showing that David was systematically draining your joint savings to fund an extramarital affair while lying to you about the withdrawals. That's textbook financial abuse, and David was the perpetrator, not the victim. Marcus had prepared a comprehensive response to David's legal claims, including a detailed accounting of every unauthorized transaction David had made from our joint accounts. The evidence was so overwhelming that Marcus was confident we could not only protect our remaining assets, but also secure a judgment requiring David to reimburse me for the money he'd spent on his affair. But the most satisfying development came 2 weeks later, when Marcus called to inform me that David's attorney had contacted him about a potential settlement. David was apparently eager to resolve our divorce quickly and quietly, without the publicity that would come from a trial focusing on his financial misconduct and tax fraud. David is offering to accept a significantly smaller share of your joint assets in exchange for your agreement not to pursue criminal charges related to the tax fraud, Marcus explained. He's also willing to take full responsibility for all the credit card debt he accumulated during his affair, and he's agreed to pay child support above the state guidelines to ensure that Emma and Ryan aren't financially impacted by his poor decisions. The proposed settlement was more generous than I'd expected, but Marcus explained that David was probably motivated by more than just guilt about his behavior. David's employer had apparently learned about his practice of claiming personal expenses as business deductions, and his job at Premier Insurance Services was in jeopardy. David couldn't afford the professional consequences that would come from criminal charges related to tax fraud, especially when he was already struggling to maintain his lifestyle on his reduced income. I agreed to the settlement, not because I felt sorry for David, but because I wanted to move forward with my life without the ongoing stress of protracted legal battles. The terms were fair and would provide financial security for Emma, Ryan, and me, while ensuring that David faced appropriate consequences for his deception. 6 months after I'd confronted David with the evidence of his betrayal, our divorce was finalized. David had moved to a smaller, more affordable apartment across town and was working a second job on weekends to cover his living expenses and child support obligations. Jessica had ended their relationship within 2 months of our separation, unwilling to subsidize David's lifestyle or deal with the drama surrounding his divorce. Emma and Ryan maintained a relationship with their father, but they were old enough to understand that David's current circumstances were the result of his own choices rather than my vindictiveness. Emma had started her senior year of high school with full confidence that her college plans would proceed as scheduled, and Ryan had resumed his normal activities without the underlying tension that had characterized our household during David's months of deception. As for me, I discovered that single parenthood was significantly easier than trying to maintain a marriage with someone who was systematically lying to me every day. My finances were more predictable and manageable without David's secret spending, and my emotional energy was no longer consumed by the exhausting work of trying to understand why my husband seemed increasingly distant and distracted. I also discovered that I genuinely enjoyed my own company and my independence. For 18 years, I'd defined myself primarily as David's wife and Emma and Ryan's mother. But now I had the opportunity to rediscover who Sarah Mitchell was as an individual. I started taking evening art classes at the community college, something I'd always wanted to do but had never prioritized during my marriage. I joined a hiking group for single women over 40, and I was surprised by how much I enjoyed the physical challenge and social connection. Most importantly, I learned that I was much stronger and more capable than I'd realized during my marriage. David had often implied that I was too trusting, too naive, too financially unsophisticated to handle complex decisions on my own. But when faced with the necessity of protecting myself and my children from his deception, I'd been able to take decisive action, navigate complex legal and financial systems, and advocate effectively for my own interests. 1 year after David moved out, I was sitting on my front porch on a Sunday evening, watching Emma practice driving in our driveway while Ryan shot baskets in the street with Tom Bradley's grandson. The scene was peaceful and normal in a way that our family life hadn't been for months before David's departure. There was no underlying tension, no sense that someone was hiding important information, no feeling that I needed to walk on eggshells to avoid triggering an argument about finances or household responsibilities. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I was surprised to see David's name on the screen. The message was brief and uncharacteristically humble. Sarah, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I understand now how much damage I caused. You and the kids deserved better than what I gave you. I hope you're happy. I read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. David's acknowledgement of his behavior was too little and far too late to change anything about our relationship, but I appreciated that he'd finally stopped trying to minimize or justify his actions. Perhaps losing his comfortable double life and facing the financial consequences of his deception had given him some perspective on the true cost of his choices. As Emma successfully parallel parked on her first attempt, and Ryan made 3 free throws in a row, I realized that David's betrayal had ultimately been a gift, though not one I would have chosen to receive. His lies had forced me to become financially independent, emotionally self-sufficient, and much more aware of my own worth and capabilities. I'd learned that I didn't need someone else to manage my money, make my decisions, or validate my choices. I'd discovered that I was perfectly capable of building a stable, happy life on my own terms. The house on Maple Street was still the same 2-story structure where I'd raised my children and built what I thought was a stable marriage. But now it felt entirely mine in a way it never had during my 18 years with David. Every room reflected my preferences and priorities. Every financial decision supported my goals and values, and every day brought the satisfaction of knowing that I was living authentically rather than maintaining a facade that only I had believed was real. David had told Jessica that his wife was already gone, and in a way he'd been right. The naive, trusting woman who had believed his lies and enabled his deception was gone, replaced by someone much stronger and more self-aware. But unlike David's bank account, my disappearance had been a transformation rather than a loss. I hadn't vanished. I'd simply finally learned to value myself as much as I'd once valued preserving my marriage. The woman David had taken for granted was indeed gone, but the woman who had emerged from the wreckage of his betrayal was someone I was proud to be. And unlike the money David had stolen and spent, my strength and independence were assets that no one could ever take away from me again. 3 years had passed since the morning I discovered David's double life, and I was standing in the kitchen of my renovated house on Maple Street, preparing dinner for a celebration I could never have imagined during those dark months of betrayal and legal battles. Emma was home from UC San Diego for spring break, having just completed her junior year with a double major in business and communications. Ryan was now 17, captain of his high school soccer team, and already receiving recruitment letters from several colleges. The transformation in our family's circumstances wasn't just financial, it was foundational. The house itself reflected the changes in our lives. What had once been David's home office was now my art studio, filled with canvases, easels, and the creative projects that had become my passion and, surprisingly, a secondary source of income. The dining room where I'd confronted David with evidence of his betrayal had been completely redesigned with a new table, new chairs, and walls painted in warm colors that invited conversation rather than conflict. Every room told the story of a woman who had reclaimed her space and filled it with joy rather than compromise. My career had flourished in ways I'd never anticipated during my marriage. 6 months after my divorce was finalized, I'd been promoted to Senior Marketing Coordinator at Riverside Health Partners, with responsibilities that included managing digital campaigns for 3 different medical practices. The confidence I'd gained from successfully navigating my divorce had translated into professional assertiveness that my supervisors noticed and rewarded. My salary had increased by nearly 30% over the past 2 years, and I'd been invited to speak at marketing conferences about healthcare communication strategies. But the most unexpected development was the art business I'd accidentally created. What had started as therapeutic painting classes at the community college had evolved into commissioned portraits and custom artwork that generated enough income to fund family vacations and contribute significantly to Emma and Ryan's college funds. Word had spread through social media about my work, and I now had a waiting list of clients who wanted personalized pieces for their homes and offices. The irony wasn't lost on me that my creative pursuits, which David had always dismissed as impractical hobbies, were now generating more monthly income than his insurance commissions had provided during the final years of our marriage. Art had become both my emotional outlet and my path to financial independence, proving that the dreams David had discouraged were actually valuable investments in my future. Emma walked into the kitchen carrying her laptop, her face bright with the kind of excitement that made me remember why I'd fought so hard to protect her college opportunities during the divorce proceedings. She'd grown into a confident young woman who balanced academic excellence with social consciousness, volunteering at women's shelters and organizing financial literacy workshops for teenage girls. "Mom," Emma said, setting her computer on the counter, "I just got the email about my internship application. I got the position with the nonprofit in San Francisco that helps women start their own businesses after leaving abusive relationships. I'll be working directly with their financial empowerment program this summer." I hugged her tightly, overwhelmed with pride at the woman she was becoming. Emma's choice to focus her career on helping other women achieve independence wasn't coincidental. She'd watched me transform from a financially dependent wife into a self-sufficient business owner, and she'd decided she wanted to help other women make similar transitions. "The internship is unpaid," Emma continued, "but they're providing housing, and I'll be able to use the experience for my senior thesis project about economic factors in domestic abuse recovery. Plus, the woman who runs the program said she might have a full-time position available when I graduate next year." Emma's academic focus on women's economic empowerment had emerged directly from her observations about my divorce and recovery. She'd written her sophomore research paper about financial abuse in marriages, interviewing me extensively about my experience with David's deception and the legal strategies that had helped me recover my assets. Her professors had been so impressed with her insights that they'd encouraged her to consider graduate school in public policy or social work. Ryan joined us in the kitchen, still wearing his soccer uniform and carrying the trophy his team had just won at the regional championship. At 17, he'd grown into a thoughtful young man who understood that his father's absence from important events wasn't about conflicting priorities, but about David's continued struggle to rebuild his life after the consequences of his poor choices. "Did Dad text you about the game?" Ryan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. David had missed the last 4 soccer games, claiming work conflicts that Ryan and I both understood were probably related to his ongoing financial difficulties. "Not yet," I replied diplomatically. "But you know how proud he is of your success, even when he can't be there to see it in person." Ryan nodded, but I could see the disappointment he tried to hide. David's relationship with both children had become increasingly strained as they'd grown old enough to understand the full scope of his betrayal and its ongoing consequences. David loved Emma and Ryan, but his ability to be consistently present and supportive had been compromised by the financial and professional problems that resulted from his affair and subsequent divorce. David now worked 2 jobs to meet his child, support obligations, and maintain his modest apartment across town. His career in insurance had ended when his employer discovered his practice of claiming personal expenses as business deductions, and he'd struggled to find comparable employment with his damaged professional reputation. He currently worked as a sales associate at an electronics store during the day and delivered food for an app-based service on evenings and weekends. The financial stress had taken a visible toll on David's physical and emotional health. When he picked up Emma and Ryan for their monthly visits, he looked older and more worn than his 48 years would suggest. He'd lost weight, developed premature gray hair, and seemed perpetually tired in a way that suggested his current lifestyle wasn't sustainable long-term. Emma and Ryan maintained their relationship with their father, but their conversations with me revealed their growing understanding that David's current circumstances were the direct result of choices he'd made during our marriage. They felt sorry for him, but they also felt angry about the disruption his lies had caused in our family, and they increasingly appreciated the stability and honesty that characterized our home environment. Jessica had disappeared from David's life entirely within 6 months of our separation, unwilling to navigate the emotional and financial complications that came with dating a recently divorced man who was struggling to meet his basic obligations. David had apparently attempted to date other women since then, but his circumstances made it difficult to maintain relationships with people who expected financial stability and emotional availability. My own romantic life had been deliberately quiet for the first 2 years after my divorce. I'd needed time to rediscover who I was as an individual before I could consider sharing my life with someone new. But 6 months ago, I'd met James Sullivan, a recently widowed environmental engineer who shared my interest in hiking and community volunteer work. James was nothing like David in temperament or priorities. He was financially stable without being flashy, emotionally available without being needy, and genuinely interested in my art and career without trying to manage or direct my choices. Our relationship had developed slowly and naturally, based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than passionate intensity or financial convenience. James had been married for 22 years before his wife died of cancer, and he understood the importance of rebuilding trust and emotional intimacy gradually. He'd met Emma and Ryan several times, but we'd been careful not to integrate our relationship into their daily lives until we were both confident about our long-term compatibility. Tonight's dinner was actually a celebration of James's job promotion to senior project manager at his environmental consulting firm, a position that would allow him to work remotely several days per week and travel less frequently. We'd been discussing the possibility of moving in together, but we wanted to make sure Emma and Ryan were completely comfortable with the transition before we made any major changes to our living arrangements. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock, and I opened it to find James holding a bouquet of wildflowers and a bottle of wine, smiling with the kind of genuine warmth that had attracted me to him from our first meeting at a Sierra Club fundraiser. He was tall and lean, with kind eyes and graying temples that made him look distinguished rather than old. Everything about his presence in my life felt natural and unforced. "Congratulations on the promotion," I said, accepting his kiss and stepping aside to let him into the house that had become a symbol of my independence and recovery. James had been in my home many times over the past 6 months, but I still enjoyed watching his face as he noticed small changes I'd made to the decor or new artwork I'd completed since his last visit. He genuinely appreciated the creative energy that filled every room, and he often asked thoughtful questions about my artistic process and business development. Emma and Ryan greeted James with the comfortable familiarity that had developed over months of shared meals and conversations. James had never tried to position himself as a replacement father figure, but he'd offered practical advice about college applications and soccer scholarships when asked, and he'd shown genuine interest in their academic and athletic achievements. During dinner, Emma shared details about her summer internship plans, and Ryan discussed his college recruitment opportunities. James listened attentively and asked intelligent questions that demonstrated his investment in their futures. The why? Conversation was relaxed and optimistic, focused on possibilities and achievements rather than problems and limitations. As we cleared the dinner dishes, Emma pulled me aside in the kitchen with a serious expression that reminded me of the conversations we'd had during the darkest months of my divorce proceedings. "Mom," she said quietly, "I want you to know that Ryan and I both really like James. We can see how happy you are when you're with him, and we think you should stop worrying about whether we're ready for you to have a serious relationship." I appreciated Emma's maturity and insight, but I also wanted to make sure she and Ryan understood that their comfort and security would always be my first priority. "Emma, you know that nothing is more important to me than making sure you and Ryan feel safe and supported at home." Emma smiled and hugged me tightly. "Mom, we've watched you build this amazing life for us over the past 3 years. You've shown us what it looks like when someone takes control of their circumstances and creates something better from difficult situations. We trust your judgment about James because we've seen how good your judgment is about everything else." Later that evening, after Emma and Ryan had gone to their rooms and James and I were sitting on the front porch with glasses of wine, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since the morning I'd discovered David's betrayal. The woman who had been married to David for 18 years would never have imagined that she could be sitting on her own front porch, financially independent, creatively fulfilled, and planning a future with someone who valued her intelligence and autonomy. James reached over and took my hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "Sarah," he said softly, "I know we've been taking things slowly, and I understand why that's been important for you and the kids. But I want you to know that I'm ready to make this relationship more serious whenever you are." I looked at James, this man who had entered my life at exactly the right moment, when I was strong enough to choose a partner rather than need one. He represented everything I'd learned to value through the painful process of recovering from David's deception: honesty, stability, respect, and genuine partnership. "I'm ready too," I replied, squeezing his hand. "But I want you to understand that I'm not the same woman I was during my marriage. I've learned to value my independence, and I'm not willing to compromise my financial autonomy or creative pursuits for anyone." James smiled and brought my hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. "Sarah, I fell in love with the strong, independent woman you are today. I have no interest in changing you or limiting your choices. I want to build something together that makes both of our lives better, not something that requires either of us to give up the things that make us happy." As we sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, I thought about the text message David had sent me over a year ago, acknowledging the damage he'd caused and expressing hope that I was happy. At the time, I'd been too focused on moving forward to respond, but now I realized that I could answer his question with complete honesty. I was happy, but not in the way David probably imagined. I wasn't happy because I'd found someone to replace him or because I'd recovered financially from his betrayal. I was happy because I'd discovered that I was capable of creating a life that reflected my values and priorities, regardless of other people's choices or circumstances. The house on Maple Street was still the same structure where I'd raised my children and discovered my husband's lies, but it had been transformed into something entirely different. A home that belonged completely to me, filled with people who chose to be there rather than people who felt trapped or resentful. Every room reflected my personality and preferences. Every financial decision supported my goals, and every relationship was based on mutual respect and honesty. Emma would graduate from college in 1 year with job prospects in a field she was passionate about, equipped with the financial literacy and emotional strength to build her own independent life. Ryan would have his choice of college soccer programs, confident in his ability to pursue his goals without worrying about his family's financial stability. Both children had learned from watching my recovery that setbacks could become opportunities for growth, and that personal strength was more valuable than any external security. James and I were planning to move in together after Emma graduated, combining our households while maintaining our individual financial independence and career ambitions. We'd already discussed our shared interest in traveling, volunteering, and eventually starting a foundation that would provide financial assistance to women leaving abusive relationships. My art business continued to grow, with a gallery in downtown Riverside, now featuring several of my pieces and interest from collectors in Los Angeles and San Francisco. What had started as therapeutic creative expression had become a legitimate source of income and personal fulfillment that exceeded anything I'd achieved during my marriage. Most importantly, I'd learned that my worth wasn't determined by other people's treatment of me or their assessment of my value. David's betrayal had initially made me question my judgment and desirability, but the process of rebuilding my life had taught me that his actions reflected his character deficits, not mine. The woman David had dismissed as too trusting and financially naive had successfully navigated complex legal proceedings, built multiple income streams, raised 2 exceptional children as a single mother, and created a life filled with creativity, purpose, and genuine happiness. His assessment of my capabilities had been as inaccurate as his assessment of the sustainability of his deception. As James and I prepared to go inside for the evening, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When I opened it, I saw that it was from Jessica, the first communication I'd received from her since our phone conversation 3 years earlier. The message was brief but significant. "Mrs. Mitchell, I wanted you to know that I'm getting married next month to someone wonderful who has been completely honest with me from the beginning. I've never forgotten the advice you gave me about not taking responsibility for solving other people's problems. Thank you for helping me understand that I deserved better than what David was offering. I hope you're happy and healthy." I showed the message to James, who smiled and shook his head in amazement. "Even David's girlfriend learned important lessons from your experience with him. You really did turn his betrayal into something positive for everyone except David himself." I deleted Jessica's message after reading it, not because I was angry or bitter, but because her communication represented a chapter of my life that was truly closed. David's affair had been devastating when I discovered it, but it had also been the catalyst for the most important growth and transformation of my adult life. That night, as I lay in my own bed in my own house, surrounded by the artwork I'd created, and the life I'd built through my own choices and efforts, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with romantic relationships or financial security. I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that you've faced a devastating challenge and emerged stronger, wiser, and more authentic than you were before. David had told Jessica that his wife was already gone, and in the end, he'd been prophetic rather than merely deceptive. The woman who had trusted blindly, compromised endlessly, and defined herself through other people's needs and expectations was indeed gone. But unlike David's bank account, my disappearance had been a transformation into something better, rather than a loss of something valuable. The woman who remained was someone I was proud to be, financially independent, creatively fulfilled, emotionally strong, and surrounded by people who chose to love and support me because of who I was, not because of what I could provide for them. David's betrayal had cost him everything that truly mattered, but it had given me the opportunity to discover everything I was capable of becoming. 3 years later, I could honestly say that being deceived and abandoned had been the beginning of the best chapter of my life. And unlike the money David had stolen and spent, the strength and wisdom I'd gained were assets that would continue to grow in value for the rest of my life. 5 years after I first discovered David's betrayal, I was standing in the grand ballroom of the Riverside Convention Center, wearing a midnight blue gown and accepting an award I never could have imagined receiving during my marriage. The California Women's Business Association was honoring me as their Entrepreneur of the Year, recognizing both my successful art business and the nonprofit foundation I'd established to help women achieve financial independence after leaving abusive relationships. The award ceremony was attended by over 300 people, including successful businesswomen from across the state, politicians, and media representatives. As I stood at the podium holding my crystal award, looking out at an audience that included Emma, Ryan, James, and dozens of women whose lives had been changed by the Sarah Mitchell Foundation, I felt a profound sense of purpose that transcended any personal satisfaction. My acceptance speech focused on the importance of turning personal pain into public service and the power of financial literacy in helping women escape dangerous situations. I spoke about the correlation between economic dependence and domestic abuse and the practical steps that could help women build safety nets before they needed them. The audience was engaged and responsive, and several women approached me afterward to share their own stories of financial manipulation and recovery. Emma, now 24 and working as a policy analyst for a San Francisco nonprofit that advocated for domestic violence survivors, had driven down from the Bay Area specifically to attend the ceremony. She looked elegant and confident in her professional attire, every inch the accomplished young woman I'd hoped she would become when I was fighting to protect her college fund during my divorce proceedings. After the formal ceremony ended, Emma and I walked together through the lobby of the convention center, surrounded by the congratulations and networking conversations that always followed these kinds of events. Emma's presence at my award ceremony felt symbolic of how far our family had traveled from the dark months when I'd first discovered David's lies and financial theft. "Mom," Emma said as we found a quiet corner away from the crowd, "I've been thinking about something all evening, and I wanted to share it with you while we have a few minutes alone." I could tell from her expression that she had something important on her mind, and I was grateful for the opportunity to have a serious conversation amid the celebration and social obligations of the evening. Watching you receive that award tonight, and listening to your speech about turning pain into purpose, I realized something about our family's story that I've never articulated before, Emma continued. What Dad did to us was terrible, and it caused real damage that took years to repair. But if he hadn't betrayed us the way he did, you might never have discovered how strong and capable you really were. Emma's observation was profound and accurate, in ways that sometimes made me uncomfortable to acknowledge. My marriage to David had been built on traditional role divisions that had left me financially dependent and professionally limited, even though I'd had my own career and income. I'd deferred to his judgment about investments, major purchases, and long-term planning, believing that his business background made him more qualified to handle our family's financial decisions. The irony was that David's financial management had been objectively poor, even before he'd started stealing from our joint accounts to fund his affair. He'd made several investment decisions during our marriage that had lost money, and he'd consistently overspent our budget on luxury items that provided no long-term value. My naive trust in his financial expertise had been misplaced from the beginning, though it had taken his outright theft to force me to recognize the problem. Emma continued her reflection as we walked toward the parking garage where James was, waiting with the car. I majored in business and policy specifically because I watched you navigate complex legal and financial systems during your divorce, and I saw how much power comes from understanding those systems yourself. I never want to be in a position where I have to trust someone else to manage my financial security or make decisions about my future. Emma's career choices and life philosophy had been directly shaped by her observations about my marriage and divorce, but in positive rather than cynical ways. She'd learned to value independence without becoming isolated, to trust carefully without becoming paranoid, and to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than economic necessity. Ryan, now 20 and a junior at UCLA on a full soccer scholarship, had also been profoundly influenced by our family's experience, though his lessons had been somewhat different from Emma's. Ryan had watched his father struggle with the consequences of dishonesty and poor financial decisions, and he'd developed a strong commitment to integrity and personal responsibility that guided his academic and athletic pursuits. Ryan's relationship with David had improved somewhat over the past 2 years, as David had finally achieved some stability in his career and personal life. David now worked as a district manager for a retail chain, a position that paid adequately but required long hours and frequent travel. He'd also completed a financial counseling program that had helped him understand the psychological factors that had contributed to his poor decision-making during our marriage. David's attempts to rebuild relationships with Emma and Ryan had been complicated by their growing understanding of how his choices had affected our family's trajectory. They loved their father, but they also recognized that his betrayal had forced all of us to become stronger and more self-reliant than we might have been otherwise. James joined us as we reached the parking garage, looking handsome and proud in his formal suit. James and I had been married for 18 months, in a small ceremony that reflected our shared values of authenticity and meaningful connection rather than expensive display. Our wedding had been held in the garden behind our house, with Emma and Ryan serving as witnesses and a small group of close friends providing love and support. Our marriage was built on principles I'd learned through the painful process of recovering from David's betrayal. James and I maintained separate financial accounts while also contributing to joint household expenses, ensuring that neither of us could be financially victimized by the other's poor decisions. We made major purchases and investment decisions together, but we each retained the autonomy to pursue our individual career goals and creative interests. James had been incredibly supportive of my business growth and foundation work, often helping with practical tasks like website management and event planning, but he'd never attempted to manage or direct my professional choices, understanding that my independence was fundamental to both my happiness and our relationship's success. "Sarah," James said as we drove home through the quiet streets of Riverside, "I've been watching you work toward this recognition for years, and I'm so proud of everything you've accomplished. But I'm most proud of how you've used your experience to help other women avoid the financial manipulation you experienced with David." The Sarah Mitchell Foundation had grown beyond my most optimistic projections when I'd established it 3 years earlier. What had started as a small fund providing emergency financial assistance to women leaving abusive relationships had evolved into a comprehensive program offering financial literacy education, legal advocacy, and business mentorship. We now operated programs in 6 California cities, had helped over 400 women achieve financial independence, and had partnered with law schools to provide pro bono legal services for divorce cases involving financial abuse. The foundation's work had been featured in national media, and I'd been invited to speak at conferences across the country about the intersection of domestic violence and economic manipulation. The foundation's success had also created opportunities for Emma and Ryan to contribute to meaningful work while building their own professional credentials. Emma had interned with our legal advocacy program during her final year of college, and she'd written her senior thesis about policy reforms that could better protect women's financial assets during divorce proceedings. Ryan had volunteered with our financial literacy workshops during his high school years, helping to develop educational materials that were accessible to women with limited formal education. But the foundation's most important impact wasn't measurable in statistics or media coverage. It was visible in the individual women who had used our services to build safer, more independent lives for themselves and their children. I'd personally worked with dozens of women whose stories paralleled my own experience with financial deception and manipulation, and I'd seen firsthand how education and resources could transform victimhood into empowerment. One of the women I'd worked with most closely was Maria Santos, a mother of 3 who had discovered that her husband had been stealing from their joint business to fund a gambling addiction that had consumed over $200,000 in family assets. Maria had contacted the foundation after seeing a local news story about our work, desperate for guidance about protecting her remaining resources while navigating divorce proceedings. Working with Maria had reminded me of my own feelings of confusion and betrayal when I'd first discovered David's financial theft. Like me, Maria had trusted her husband completely with their family's financial management, believing that his business experience and confident demeanor meant he was making sound decisions about their future security. The foundation had connected Maria with legal representation, helped her understand her rights regarding joint business assets, and provided financial counseling that enabled her to rebuild her credit and establish independent income streams. Maria had eventually gained full control of their family business, while her ex-husband had been required to pay substantial restitution for his unauthorized use of business funds. 3 years after first contacting the foundation, Maria had expanded their family business into a successful restaurant chain, had paid off all the debts her ex-husband had accumulated, and had established college funds for all 3 of her children. She'd also become a volunteer with our financial literacy program, helping other women understand business accounting and legal protections. Maria's transformation from financial victim to successful business owner exemplified the foundation's core mission, providing women with the knowledge and resources they needed to protect themselves from economic manipulation while building sustainable independence. Her success story had been featured in our annual report and had helped us secure additional funding from donors who understood the practical impact of our work. As James, Emma, Ryan, and I sat in our living room after the award ceremony, sharing wine and reflecting on the evening's significance, I found myself thinking about the ripple effects of personal choices and how individual experiences could influence broader social change. David's betrayal had initially felt like a private family crisis, something shameful that needed to be managed quietly to protect our children and preserve our social relationships. But the process of recovering from his deception had taught me that financial abuse was a widespread problem that thrived in secrecy and silence, and that sharing my experience could help other women recognize and respond to similar manipulation. The Foundation's educational workshops consistently revealed that many women had experienced some form of financial abuse, but hadn't recognized it as such until they heard other women's stories. Credit cards opened without consent, paychecks deposited into accounts they couldn't access, major purchases made without consultation, retirement funds borrowed against without discussion. These were common experiences that women had often dismissed as normal relationship dynamics rather than identifying them as forms of economic control. My public speaking about financial abuse had also revealed the gender-specific nature of economic manipulation in relationships. While both men and women could be victims of financial abuse, the patterns of deception and control often reflected broader social inequalities about financial literacy and economic power. Women were more likely to defer to their partner's financial expertise, more likely to sacrifice their own career advancement for family obligations, and more likely to be excluded from major financial decisions despite contributing substantially to household income. These cultural patterns created vulnerabilities that manipulative partners could exploit, often for years before victims recognized what was happening. The Foundation's research had documented clear connections between financial control and other forms of domestic abuse, confirming what advocates had long understood about the role of economic dependence in trapping women in dangerous relationships. Women who lacked independent access to money, credit, and housing often remained in abusive situations far longer than they would have chosen if they'd had realistic alternatives. Our legal advocacy program had been particularly successful in helping women recover assets that had been hidden or misused by their partners during divorce proceedings. Working with forensic accountants and specialized attorneys, we'd helped clients trace stolen funds, challenge fraudulent transfers, and secure orders protecting remaining assets from additional manipulation. The program had also advocated for policy changes that would better protect women's financial interests during divorce proceedings, including requirements for full financial disclosure, penalties for asset dissipation, and streamlined processes for emergency asset protection. Emma's senior thesis had contributed to this advocacy work, providing research about the long-term economic consequences of financial abuse and the effectiveness of various legal remedies. Ryan's contributions to the foundation had focused on educational outreach and social media engagement, helping to develop materials that could reach younger women who might be experiencing financial manipulation in their first serious relationships. His generation's comfort with digital communication had been invaluable in expanding our educational reach and connecting with women who might not attend traditional workshops or seminars. Ryan had also helped develop educational programs for high schools and colleges, focusing on financial literacy and healthy relationship dynamics. These programs emphasized the importance of maintaining individual financial accounts and credit histories, even within committed relationships, and the warning signs of partners who sought to control or limit their access to money and financial information. As the evening wound down and Emma prepared to drive back to San Francisco the next morning, she asked me a question that surprised me with its directness and insight. "Mom," she said, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if Dad had been honest about his problems with our marriage instead of lying and stealing? Do you think you two could have worked things out if he'd approached the situation differently?" I considered Emma's question carefully, as I had many times over the past 5 years. David's affair and financial theft had been devastating betrayals, but they'd also been symptoms of deeper problems in our marriage that had existed long before Jessica entered the picture. The honest answer, Emma, is that I don't think our marriage could have survived even if David had been completely forthright about his unhappiness. We'd grown apart over the years in ways that neither of us had been willing to acknowledge, and we'd developed completely different values about money, honesty, and personal responsibility. I paused, thinking about how to articulate the complex feelings I'd developed about my marriage to David over the years of recovery and reflection. What I've learned through therapy and through working with other women is that David's affair was probably inevitable, given the way he'd been thinking about our relationship and his own happiness. But the financial theft and systematic lying were choices that revealed character problems I could never have overlooked, even if he'd confessed everything voluntarily. Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I think what bothers me most about Dad's behavior isn't even the affair itself, but the way he let you continue contributing to the joint account while he was stealing from it. That feels like a level of manipulation that goes beyond normal relationship problems." Emma's insight was accurate and reflected the sophisticated understanding she'd developed about financial abuse through her academic work and observations about our family's experience. David's betrayal hadn't been a moment of weakness or poor judgment. It had been a sustained campaign of deception that had required planning, calculation, and deliberate manipulation of my trust. The Foundation's work with financial abuse victims had taught me that this kind of systematic deception was rarely limited to money. Partners who were willing to steal from joint accounts and lie about major financial decisions usually displayed similar patterns of manipulation and control in other areas of their relationships. David's willingness to let me continue contributing to our savings account while he was draining it for his affair demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect for my autonomy and intelligence that would have made any genuine reconciliation impossible. Even if he'd ended his affair and sought counseling, the underlying contempt for my rights and interests that his behavior revealed would have poisoned any attempts to rebuild our marriage. James, who had been listening quietly to our conversation, offered his own perspective as someone who had observed our family's recovery from the outside. "From my perspective," James said carefully, "Sarah's experience with David taught her to value honesty and independence in ways that have made our marriage stronger and healthier than it could have been otherwise. David's betrayal was terrible, but it also forced Sarah to discover capabilities and strengths she might never have developed if their marriage had continued unchanged." James's observation was insightful and reflected conversations we'd had many times about the unexpected benefits that had emerged from the wreckage of my first marriage. My relationship with James was built on principles I'd learned through painful experience: complete financial transparency, respect for individual autonomy, and commitment to honest communication even when difficult topics arose. James and I had prenuptial agreements that protected both of our individual assets, while also establishing clear guidelines for joint financial responsibilities. We maintained separate investment accounts and career development funds, ensuring that neither of us would ever be financially dependent on the other's decision-making or continued presence. Our marriage also included explicit agreements about major purchases, travel plans, and social obligations, eliminating the kind of unilateral decision-making that had characterized my relationship with David. We consulted each other about important choices, But we each retained the authority to pursue our individual goals and interests without requiring permission or approval. These safeguards might have seemed excessive or unromantic to couples who hadn't experienced financial betrayal, but they provided a foundation of security and trust that allowed James and me to build genuine intimacy without fear of manipulation or deception. As Emma prepared to leave the next morning, she hugged me tightly and whispered something that brought tears to my eyes. "Mom," she said, "I want you to know that watching you rebuild your life after Dad's betrayal taught me that women don't have to accept being treated badly, even by people they love. You showed me that we have the power to create the kind of life we want, regardless of other people's choices or limitations." Emma's words captured the most important legacy of my experience. With David's betrayal and my subsequent recovery, I'd transformed personal pain into public service, individual growth into family wisdom, and private struggle into broader social impact. The woman who had been married to David for 18 years would never have imagined that she could receive statewide recognition for business success, establish a foundation that changed hundreds of lives, or model independence and strength for her children in ways that would influence their entire approach to relationships and career development. David's betrayal had cost him everything that truly mattered: his family's respect, his financial security, his professional reputation, and his sense of personal integrity. But his betrayal had given me the opportunity to discover capabilities and purposes I'd never known I possessed.